Demon Souls, masterpiece. Dark Souls 1 and 3, masterpiece, masterpiece. Bloodborne, Sekiro, Elden Ring, masterpiece, masterpiece, masterpiece. Dark Souls 2. It's hard to find a series with as much success as FromSoft's Souls series. For just over 15 years, they've delivered nothing but hit after hit after, honestly not as bad as most people say, hit. But as we near 3 years since the release of Elden Ring, I have to wonder, how is FromSoft going to innovate on this formula and produce another masterpiece? In every single Souls game, they've innovated and delivered an amazing product, and continuing to do so will be immensely difficult. I have complete faith in FromSoft to do this, but having played through every single Souls game myself, I think I've stumbled across a few things that they could alter or innovate on for their next title that would make it the best. So let's talk about it. Where are there areas of innovation for Souls games, and how can FromSoft continue to make this series as great as it can be? Okay, first of all, we have to define what makes a Souls game great. I think there's 3 main points that we can put into this horrible triforce of pain and agony that makes these games amazing. Let's just get the obvious out of the way first. We all know that Miyazaki isn't a man, but is an ancient death god who can't reach paradise until he's inflicted suffering upon millions of people, so obviously difficulty is key to these games. Secondly, figuring out who you are, the details of the world and the history, and why you're questing in the first place is tougher than Chinese algebra, so we have to keep things vague. Lastly, Souls games allow you to explore large, interconnected worlds, so we need to keep that as well. Difficulty that makes you want to throw your computer out the window, a plot more vague than Ulysses, and a large interconnected world that would make Metroid blush. These are the 3 things that make a good Souls game. But what can FromSoft add to the formula to make the next entry even better? First, let's talk about combat. When Demon Souls first came out, it revolutionized so much, and it kickstarted a whole new genre. But honestly, the way your character controlled back then was like a pregnant elephant on benzos. It was a little clunky, but we made do with what we had. Because of this, you had to play defensively. There was no jumping off a cliff and stabbing a snake in the face like your Goku or something like that. Instead, you were a lot more likely to die to the first enemy you found because you were just positioned incorrectly. Combat was a slow endeavor where you had to very carefully weigh your options before inevitably getting killed by the old monk for the 42nd time in a row. Demon Souls players, you know what I'm talking about. But as time went on and technology improved, combat and movement became faster and more versatile. In Bloodborne, you're considered a hunter, and the fast movement and frantic combat reflects that. In Sekiro, you have a grappling hook and can quickly engage in combat and zip all around the map like the ninja that weird kid in middle school always wanted to be. In Elden Ring, they continued with Sekiro's innovation of adding a jump button, and it revolutionized the entire combat experience. No, seriously, adding a jump button was a huge revolution to combat, and I think it's a testament to FromSoft's technical abilities where they can take something we've seen in millions of games before and use it in a way that makes their combat completely redefined. If you lay out all the Souls games in order of release, you can see that the gameplay has changed significantly. Starting at Demon Souls, you had this slow, defensive, box turtle-like gameplay, whereas in Elden Ring and Sekiro, you have this quick, aggressive, Baltimore crackhead sort of gameplay. I think that this trajectory is great, and FromSoft should continue it, but sadly, there are still some relics that remain from the old days that slow down the modern combat and movement systems. Switching weapons and armor in this game is like something out of a 90s CRPG, and I hate it. It's slow, it's cumbersome, it's difficult to find what you're looking for, and usually halfway through switching all this up, you're gonna get bodied by some random enemy. I think because it's so difficult to change up loadouts and playstyles, a lot of novice players don't, and they just stick with one playstyle. And I think that's a shame. Why not allow players to save a select number of unique builds and hot swap between them? I think doing this would allow players to more aggressively pursue their enemies regardless of the enemy type or the environment, and ultimately would lead to more strategic and versatile combat. I also think FromSoft needs to trim down some of the more overpowered or slow combat options. I loved how in Sekiro you had to master the blade. You didn't have access to an axe or a staff or perfume bottles. What even is that? You had one weapon type, and if you couldn't figure that out, the only thing you could do is turn off the game and try something a little bit more your speed. However, in Elden Ring, there are objectively easier play styles. I can make a big fat-ass Chungus guy who one-shots everyone with a greatsword, and a lot of the difficulty in the game completely evaporates. Like, yeah, that was alright for me in Elden Ring because I'm lazy and stupid, but honestly, I think I preferred it in Sekiro where they forced me to use a weapon type that I normally wouldn't use. It was a lot more difficult, but in the end, it was a lot more fulfilling and fun for me. Forcing the player to adapt to a faster, more challenging combat environment by introducing a quick swap mechanic while eliminating some of the slower, more powerful weapon options would be a great step forward for FromSoft to make the next game just a little bit harder and a little bit more fun. This in and of itself would be great. But I think there's something else FromSoft should look to innovate on that has remained stagnant for this entire series. In some games, you can fight hundreds of enemies at once, but in Elden Ring, at most, you'll see like 5 or 6 guys together that you can fight. There's some exceptions to this, but in general, you're not going to fight more than a few people at a time. Again, the technical limitations of 2010 are to blame for this. In the original Demon's Souls, they couldn't have a lot of enemies on screen at once because of processing power limitations. But that's not an issue these days. If they're going to make the new Souls games have more aggressive and frenetic combat, I think a natural pairing with that would be to have more enemies on screen. We don't need to get to Dynasty Warriors levels of enemies on the screen, but I think we should at least inch in that direction. Wow, Dynasty Warriors. I used to play that game on the PS2 like crazy. I spent hundreds of hours. I have nothing but fond memories of this game, and I think that, oh my god, it's Lu Bu! Everyone run, it's Lu Bu!
It's Lu Bu! Lu Bu's come to destroy us!
Also, these enemies are dumber than I was when I was 11 and I sold my copy of Blast Corps for the N64. Young me, what are you doing? That game's great! Look how expensive it is now. You can't relive those memories. Fighting a bunch of enemies that just shamble around and have the intelligence and sight lines of Metal Gear Solid 1 characters isn't exactly the most thrilling endeavor. I think From Software should put a little bit more effort into enemy density and intelligence than none at all. Now there are plenty of games with robust enemy intelligence, so I think the majority of enemies in FromSoft's games should do more than just walk up to you and hit you with a sword. Have enemies work in a group, have them think strategically, have them use unique abilities. We see a little bit of this in Elden Ring, but I think it's time to make every enemy, even the bottom bitch foot soldiers, a little bit more of a threat. True story, when I first played through Elden Ring, I used Ranni's greatsword because that four-armed blue goddess is my bae. I love you, mommy. I also use the Mimic ability in most boss battles because I'm a soy boy coward who abuses game mechanics. When it came time for me to beat the game, I beat the last 3 bosses in a row without dying once. Now, this isn't because I'm some sort of gaming prodigy, I'm probably average at these games at best, but I was able to abuse the most overpowered weapon and the most broken ability to basically make this game far easier than it was intended to be. While the boss fights in these games feature massive enemies with flourishing abilities that cover the entire screen, once you know the boss's moveset and you know the rhythm of the fight, you can eventually just brute force your way through any encounter. Sword Saint Ishin may be one of the greatest boss battles across all of gaming, but beating him just comes down to learning his attack pattern in each stage of the fight and learning when you have to parry and when you can attack. It requires a level of precision that surpasses most games, but ultimately you can brute force your way through it, even if you told your wife 3 hours ago you're gonna go out to dinner and she has to wait. But damn it, Lindsay, we have to beat the Sword Saint now! Lindsay, Olive Garden's not going anywhere, I have to beat the Sword Saint! Every fight with Sword Saint Ishin has him recycling the same moves in each phase. The only difference is the order of these moves and his positioning. Now that's fine, but these are the same boss mechanics we've seen since like Contra 3 on the SNES. I think having boss fights that are reactive to player strategy is well past due. We see a little bit of this in Souls games, but look at something like Batman Arkham Asylum back in 2009 and that fantastic Mr. Freeze fight. Whenever Batman used one ability against Mr. Freeze, he would counter it and you would have to attack him in a different way. It's now 2025, and I think we should see more combat encounters like this. Speaking of bosses, let's go for a long shot here. The previous suggestions could all be accomplished with current technology, but if FromSoft wants to do something wholly unique, I think they should make it so that the environment is dynamic and it can be permanently altered by the player and enemies. Some games already experiment with the basics of this. Link goes into a dirty swamp, then he finds a dungeon at the center of it, he defeats the racially insensitive and hilarious boss, and then he comes out and the swamp is clean again. Great! While we've seen this in some Souls games before, this isn't exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is having enemies that use the environment to their advantage and are not restricted to the environment in which they fight you. Take that dragon encounter early on in Elden Ring. When this giant dragon swooped down on me, my asshole tightened so fast it whistled. But then when I realized that he could only fight me in this round arena-like swamp and I could just run out of it and he wouldn't chase me, the encounter became lesser because of that. Video games have been putting combat in boring, static environments for decades. Just look at something like Mass Effect 2. Whenever you were about to enter combat, you were put in an environment with all this cover there. So somebody's just talking to you like, oh hey Shepard, we're just here to talk. Just ignore the 15 waist-high barrels between me and you. We're totally not gonna fight. But what if that wasn't the case? What if enemies weren't limited to the environment in which you found them and could instead use the broader world in unique ways? I'm talking about having monkey-like enemies that jump around the trees and the only way to fight them is to cut down the trees so they come to the floor. I'm talking about having like Octorok-like river monsters where you have to grapple them and pull them to shore and then you fight them. And on the shore, they have a new moveset. I'm talking about having giant enemies that rip out a chunk of the ground, hurl it at you, and then that chunk on the ground is forever missing. Some of this is incredibly hard to do, and there are a myriad of complications that arise from trying to implement this. But if FromSoft wants to do something really unique that nobody else has ever really done, this would be a huge leap forward for their next game. For all its greatness, combat in most Souls games is relegated to the ground. Sure, there are exceptions where you can jump onto an enemy and impale them, or shoot up at a dragon's tail 50 times and get an item for some reason, but in general, combat is limited to the XZ plane. I was holding that in. But we don't have to be limited by this. In God of War 3, I'm climbing around and fighting enemies on the Y-axis constantly. In Shadow of the Colossus, I'm climbing these huge colossi and flying all over the place. In games like Devil May Cry, I'm throwing enemies into the air and shooting them and juggling them like blood-filled juggling balls. Come on, FromSoft, look at this. This is fun stuff. Nintendo already kind of paved the way for this in Breath of the Wild. Prior to Breath of the Wild, Zelda games had the same issue, where generally combat was relegated to the ground. Traversal was also just moving across fields most of the time. Sure, dungeons had some verticality, but that was kind of it. But now in Breath of the Wild, you have this glider where you can glide down, or abilities that shoot you up into the air, and it's just so much fun. It's hard to believe that we ever existed in a time without this sort of verticality in Zelda games. FromSoft, look at this and do something like this for your next game. I guarantee if you explore verticality a little bit more, your players will love it. This one might be a little bit controversial, but I'm starting to kind of hate the storytelling in these games. Now, just bear with me for 1 second. So let's say we have Finnegan's Wake at one end, and then my daughter's simple story about what's on her plate on the other end. On the one end, we have the most convoluted and complicated storytelling ever. And then on this side, we have a story about a muffin who is trying to find his friends. Oh my God, that's crazy. Souls games generally drift pretty far into the Finnegan's Wake territory, where their lore and quests and characters are all highly obtuse and details are relegated to throwaway lines or item descriptions. But Sekiro actually made the innovative decision to tell a story where you actually know who you are and know what you're doing, like in most games. While thickly veiled storytelling elements in Souls games have always garnered significant praise from the player base, I think at least taking a step in the direction of Sekiro and letting the player understand who they are and what they're doing is a fantastic thing. I spent over 100 hours playing Elden Ring, and throughout that entire game, I never really knew what I was doing or why it was important. All I really knew is that there were a bunch of monsters who were alive, and I wasn't going to rest until they weren't. And I loved Elden Ring, but honestly, a modicum of direction is not a bad thing. I'm not asking for like Metal Gear Solid 4 1-hour cutscenes where I watch it and then I'm more confused than before I watched it. All I want to know is just who I am and why my quest is important. Hey, check it out. She made the eggs and the peanuts friends. I know more about this world than I do about Elden Ring. If there's one thing Souls games are missing, it's crafting. I love a great crafting system that dominates the rest of the game and forces you. No, I'm just kidding with you. Crafting systems suck. They don't need to be in these games. Souls games have some of my favorite multiplayer elements of all time. Invading people or getting invaded by them? Perfect. Leaving messages that help players? Amazing. Leaving the message secret ahead before a cliff and causing untold thousands to run off that cliff? Still funny after 15 years. The natural next step to the system, where players can usually indirectly alter the experience of other players, is to expand these elements and allow players to indirectly affect the worlds of other players. What if, when you beat a boss, you could make it weaker or more susceptible to certain attacks after you beat it? Maybe you use lightning magic while you're fighting the boss, and that makes it weaker to lightning for other players. Or what if there's something you could do to make it stronger for other players? What if you could go into an environment and, depending on the actions you take, make it so there's more or less enemies in that environment? What if your actions could influence the drop rate for certain items in other players' games? Really, the options are endless here, and we're already seeing a lot of games experiment with this. I played Death Stranding for 60 hours, not because it took me that long to beat it, but because I wanted to build a highway system that rivaled Eisenhower's interstate. And I wanted to do this because I knew that for every single road I built, that was helping other players on their journey. Knowing that I was helping other players fueled me to put more hours into the game than I would have otherwise. I think putting systems like this in the next Souls game that allow players to impact other players for better or for worse would be a great step forward and would allow much more innovative and fun gameplay. I mean, my fondest memories with Souls games come in the form of me either helping other players or hurting them. So I think expanding the aspects of this game that allow you to do that would be great for the player base. Someone just bring Kojima into the Souls offices and let him do whatever he wants in a cubicle for a few months. He'll probably make something great. And if it's not great, at least it'll be weird and memorable. So what do you think should be in the next Souls game? It's so rare for a new genre to come about in this day and age, and Souls games did exactly that. So the Souls genre is in its relative infancy, and I think there's a lot of directions it could go. I would love to hear from you in the comments if you agree with some of my suggestions or if you have some of your own. I usually make videos once every month or so, and I'm just a one-man channel, so a like and subscribe go a very long way, and I should have a new video in about a month. Thanks guys, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.